Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell stood at attention in the briefing room, her uniform crisp and her posture perfect despite the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders. She had just returned from a grueling 18-month deployment in Afghanistan, where she had served as the lead intelligence officer for SEAL Team 7. Her record was flawless, her dedication unquestionable, and her respect among the special operations community was hard-earned through countless dangerous missions. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Admiral Harrison Webb entered the room, his polished shoes clicking against the linoleum floor with military precision. Webb was known throughout the Navy as a traditionalist, a man who believed that certain roles were simply not meant for women, regardless of their qualifications or proven capabilities. His weathered face bore the stern expression of someone who had spent decades climbing the military hierarchy, and his gray eyes held a coldness that made even seasoned officers uncomfortable. Sarah had heard the whispers about Admiral Webb long before this moment. Stories circulated through the naval community about his resistance to women in combat roles, his tendency to assign female officers to desk jobs regardless of their field experience, and his belief that the integration of women into special operations was weakening the military's effectiveness. She had hoped these stories were exaggerated, but as Webb's gaze swept over her with obvious disdain, she realized the rumors had been understated. The briefing room filled with the quiet tension that precedes a confrontation. Other officers lined the walls, some watching with curiosity, others with barely concealed discomfort. Among them stood several members of SEAL Team 7, men who had served alongside Sarah in the most dangerous corners of the world. Their faces remained neutral, but their eyes held a different story entirely. Admiral Webb cleared his throat and opened the folder in his hands, though Sarah suspected he already knew its contents by heart. The silence stretched for several long seconds before he began to speak, his voice carrying the authority of rank but lacking any warmth of respect. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell," he began, his tone formal and detached. "I've been reviewing your service record and the reports from your recent deployment." He paused deliberately, allowing the weight of his words to settle in the room. "While your technical performance has been adequate, there are concerns about your suitability for continued service in special operations environments." Sarah felt her jaw tighten slightly, but she maintained her composure. She had expected this moment for months, had prepared herself for the inevitable challenge to her career that seemed to follow every successful female officer in the special operations community. What she hadn't expected was the brazen nature of Webb's approach, the way he was attempting to undermine her achievements in front of her peers and subordinates. The Admiral continued, his voice growing slightly more pointed with each word. "The nature of special operations requires a certain physical and emotional resilience that, frankly, based on the reports I've received, may be beyond your capabilities." He closed the folder with a sharp snap. "I'm recommending your immediate transfer to an administrative position more suitable to your natural abilities." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, thick and acrid. Sarah knew that every person in the room understood exactly what Webb was implying. He wasn't questioning her technical skills or her intelligence. He was attacking the very core of her identity as a warrior, suggesting that her gender made her inherently unfit for the role she had performed with distinction for years. But what Admiral Webb hadn't counted on was the presence of the men who had served alongside Sarah in combat. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez stepped forward almost imperceptibly, his movement so subtle that only trained eyes would notice. Behind him, the rest of SEAL Team 7 began to shift their positions, creating what appeared to be a casual repositioning, but was actually a defensive formation around their lieutenant commander. Rodriguez had been Sarah's partner on more missions than he could count. He had watched her extract wounded soldiers under enemy fire, had seen her make split-second decisions that saved lives, and had witnessed her endure physical and mental challenges that would have broken lesser individuals. The idea that this admiral, who had never served alongside her in combat, could question her capabilities was not just insulting, it was dangerous to the integrity of the entire team. The tension in the room continued to build as Admiral Webb seemed to take pleasure in his verbal assault. He began to detail his plans for Sarah's reassignment, painting a picture of a desk job that would effectively end her career in special operations. His words were chosen carefully to maximize humiliation while maintaining the veneer of official military procedure. Sarah listened to each word, her mind racing through her options. She could accept the transfer quietly and preserve what remained of her career, though she knew it would mean abandoning the work she loved and the men who depended on her expertise. She could fight the decision through official channels, though she understood that Webb's influence in the Navy hierarchy would make such a battle nearly impossible to win. Or she could stand her ground here and now, regardless of the consequences. As Webb continued his monologue, describing the more appropriate roles available for female officers, something shifted in the atmosphere of the room. The SEALs who had been standing casually along the walls began to straighten, their posture becoming more formal and deliberate. Their movement was synchronized in a way that spoke of years of training and shared experience, a silent communication that needed no words. Rodriguez caught the eye of Petty Officer First Class David Chen, who had been on Sarah's left flank during the raid that had earned her a Bronze Star. Chen nodded almost imperceptibly to Petty Officer Second Class James Wilson, who had been extracted under enemy fire by Sarah herself just 6 months earlier. The silent message passed through the room like electricity through water, touching each member of the team. Admiral Webb, absorbed in his own rhetoric, failed to notice the subtle shift occurring around him. He was building toward what he clearly intended to be the climactic moment of his humiliation campaign, the point at which Sarah would be forced to accept his assessment of her inadequacy and submit to his authority. Furthermore, Webb continued, his voice rising slightly with confidence, I question whether someone of your constitution should have been placed in such a position of responsibility in the first place. The lives of these men, he gestured dismissively toward the assembled SEALs, should not be dependent on decisions made by someone who lacks the fundamental qualifications for combat leadership. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Sarah felt her face flush with anger, not at the attack on herself, but at the implication that the men she had served with were somehow victims of her leadership. She knew the sacrifices these men had made, the trust they had placed in her, and the success they had achieved together as a team. But before Sarah could formulate a response, something unexpected began to happen. Rodriguez, who had been standing at a relaxed attention, suddenly snapped to a perfect military bearing. His back straightened, his chin lifted, and his hand moved to his side in preparation for a salute. The movement was so sharp and precise that it seemed to echo through the room. Admiral Webb paused in his monologue, momentarily confused by the sudden change in Rodriguez's posture. He turned slightly to look at the chief petty officer, expecting perhaps an acknowledgement of his authority or a show of support for his position. Instead, Rodriguez's hand rose in a crisp, perfect salute, not to Admiral Webb, but directly to Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell. The gesture was unmistakable in its meaning and shocking in its boldness. In the rigid hierarchy of military protocol, enlisted personnel do not salute officers in the presence of superior officers without specific orders. Rodriguez was not just showing respect to Sarah, he was making a statement that would be impossible for anyone in the room to misinterpret. Admiral Webb's face began to flush red as he realized what was happening. He opened his mouth to issue what would undoubtedly be a harsh reprimand, but before he could speak, another movement caught his attention. Petty Officer Chen had also snapped to attention and was raising his hand in an identical salute to Sarah. Then Wilson followed suit, his movement as precise and deliberate as his teammates. one by one. Every member of SEAL Team 7 in the room came to attention and raised their hands in salute to their lieutenant commander. The silence in the room became deafening. Admiral Webb stood frozen, his mouth still partially open, as he witnessed what amounted to a coordinated act of defiance unlike anything he had seen in his decades of military service. The SEALs held their salutes with unwavering precision, their eyes focused on Sarah with an intensity that spoke of absolute loyalty and respect. Sarah herself was momentarily stunned by the gesture. She understood immediately the risk these men were taking by openly challenging a superior officer's authority. Their careers could be ended by this single act of solidarity, their reputations destroyed by what could be classified as insubordination or even mutiny. Yet as she looked into their faces, she saw no hesitation, no uncertainty. These were men who had faced enemy fire without flinching, who had made life-or-death decisions in the darkness of foreign battlefields, and who were now making another life-or-death decision in the fluorescent-lit sterility of a military briefing room. Admiral Webb finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a strangled gasp than a military command. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his authority clearly shaken by the unexpected turn of events. Rodriguez, still holding his perfect salute, spoke with the calm confidence of a man who had weighed his options and chosen his path. "Sir, we are saluting our commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, who has earned our respect through her exceptional leadership and personal courage in combat operations." The words were spoken with military formality, but their meaning was crystal clear. These men were not just showing respect to Sarah. They were rejecting Admiral Webb's assessment of her capabilities and his authority to reassign her based on gender bias rather than performance. Webb's face continued to darken as he realized the full implications of what was happening. This was not just an act of defiance against his personal authority. It was a challenge to the entire system of prejudice and discrimination that he represented. These men were putting their careers on the line to defend principles that went far beyond military protocol. The tension in the briefing room had reached a breaking point, with Admiral Webb staring in disbelief at the unprecedented display of solidarity before him. The SEALs maintained their salutes with unwavering precision, creating a tableau that would be seared into the memory of everyone present. The fluorescent lights seemed to buzz louder in the silence, as if the very building was holding its breath. Admiral Webb's training kicked in as he struggled to regain control of the situation. His face had progressed from red to a deep purple, and his hands trembled slightly with barely contained rage. He had spent his entire career building and maintaining authority through intimidation and rigid adherence to hierarchy. This moment represented everything he had fought against: enlisted men challenging the decisions of superior officers, the erosion of traditional military structure, and most infuriating of all, support for a woman in a role he believed she had no business occupying. "Stand down immediately," Webb barked, his voice cracking slightly with the strain of maintaining composure. "This is insubordination of the highest order. You will cease this display and return to attention." But the SEALs did not move. Their salutes remained firm, their eyes focused on Sarah with laser-like intensity. Rodriguez, as the senior enlisted man present, spoke again with calm authority that cut through Webb's bluster like a knife through fog. "With respect, Admiral, we are at attention, sir. We are simply recognizing the officer who has earned our respect and loyalty through her actions in combat." His voice carried no trace of disrespect toward Webb's rank. But his words made it clear that respect for position did not automatically translate to respect for the person holding that position. Sarah found herself caught between pride and terror. The loyalty these men were showing her was both humbling and frightening. She knew that their gesture, while deeply moving, could destroy not just their careers, but also their lives and the lives of their families. Military justice could be swift and harsh, especially when it came to what could be perceived as mutiny or insubordination. She also knew that she had a decision to make. She could order the men to stand down, potentially saving their careers at the cost of validating Webb's position. Or she could accept their gesture and face whatever consequences might follow, knowing that sometimes principles were worth more than personal safety. Webb began pacing behind his position, his military bearing beginning to crack under the pressure of the unprecedented situation. He had dealt with insubordination before, but never anything like this. Individual acts of defiance could be crushed with swift disciplinary action, but this was different. This was a coordinated statement by an entire team of elite warriors, men whose reputations and service records were beyond reproach. "You think your little demonstration changes anything?" Webb snarled, his composure finally beginning to slip completely. "You think standing there like toy soldiers makes this woman any more qualified to lead men into combat? This is exactly the kind of emotional nonsense that proves my point." The Admiral's words revealed more than he perhaps intended. His use of "this woman" instead of Sarah's rank and name exposed the personal nature of his prejudice. His dismissal of their gesture as emotional nonsense demonstrated his fundamental misunderstanding of military loyalty and brotherhood. Petty Officer Chen, still holding his salute, spoke up from his position. "Admiral Webb, sir. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell saved my life during Operation Thunder Ridge. She pulled me out of a collapsed building under enemy fire when she could have completed the mission and left me behind. She chose to risk her own life and the lives of the team to ensure no one was left behind." Chen's words were spoken with quiet intensity, and they carried the weight of absolute truth. Other officers in the room, who had only heard second-hand accounts of Sarah's combat service, were beginning to understand the depth of loyalty she had earned from these men. Wilson stepped forward slightly, still maintaining his salute. "Sir, during the Kandahar operation, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell made tactical decisions that saved the lives of 12 hostages and ensured the safe extraction of our entire team. Her situational awareness and leadership under fire were exemplary." One by one, other team members began to speak, each recounting specific instances where Sarah's leadership, courage, or quick thinking had made the difference between life and death. Their words painted a picture of an officer who had repeatedly proven herself in the crucible of combat, who had earned respect not through politics or favoritism, but through actions that spoke louder than any evaluation report. Admiral Webb listened to these testimonials with growing frustration. Each story undermined his narrative. Each account of Sarah's competence and courage made his position more difficult to defend. He found himself in the uncomfortable position of arguing against the first-hand experiences of the very men he claimed to be protecting. "Enough!" Webb finally shouted, his military bearing completely abandoned. "I don't care about your war stories or your misplaced loyalty. The fact remains that women do not belong in combat roles, period. This entire experiment has been a disaster from the beginning, and I will not allow political correctness to compromise the effectiveness of our special operations units." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence carried a different quality. Webb's outburst had stripped away any pretense of objectivity or professional evaluation. He had revealed his true motivations, showing that his opposition to Sarah was based not on her performance or qualifications, but on his personal beliefs about gender roles in the military. Sarah felt something shift inside her as she listened to Webb's words. The fear and uncertainty she had been feeling began to transform into something else, a quiet, burning determination. She had spent years proving herself, years accepting that she had to work twice as hard for half the recognition, years enduring subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination. But this moment was different. This was no longer about her career or her personal ambitions. This was about the principle that merit should matter more than prejudice. Rodriguez sensed the change in the room's dynamic. His years of experience had taught him to read situations and people with remarkable accuracy. He could see that Admiral Webb had overplayed his hand, revealing his true motivations in a way that would be difficult to walk back. More importantly, he could see that Sarah was reaching a decision point. "Admiral," Sarah said, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began. Her voice was steady and clear, carrying the authority she had earned through years of service and sacrifice. "These men are not demonstrating misplaced loyalty. They are recognizing leadership that has been tested in combat and proven effective under the most demanding circumstances." Webb turned to face her directly, his eyes blazing with anger and frustration. "You will not lecture me about leadership, Lieutenant Commander. Your very presence in this organization undermines the traditions and effectiveness that have made our special operations forces the finest in the world." "Sir," Sarah continued, her voice remaining calm despite the personal nature of the attack, "with respect, I believe you are confusing tradition with prejudice. These men are not standing with me because I am a woman. They are standing with me because I am a warrior who has earned their trust and respect through shared sacrifice and proven competence." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah had crossed a line from which there would be no return. She was no longer simply defending her right to serve. She was challenging the fundamental assumptions that underpinned Webb's worldview. Other officers in the room began to shift uncomfortably. Some had been silent supporters of integration, believing that women could serve effectively in combat roles, but lacking the courage to speak openly against the entrenched opposition. Others had been skeptical, but were beginning to question their own assumptions as they witnessed the depth of respect these elite warriors showed for their female commanding officer. Admiral Webb realized that he was losing control of the narrative. The situation had evolved from a simple administrative reassignment into a public debate about the fundamental principles of military service. Worse, he was beginning to understand that his position was becoming increasingly untenable as more evidence of Sarah's competence was presented. In a last desperate attempt to reassert his authority, Webb decided to play what he believed was his trump card. "This discussion is over," he declared, his voice sharp with finality. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, you will report to the personnel office tomorrow morning to receive your new assignment. These men will return to their duties, and we will forget this inappropriate display ever happened." But Rodriguez was not finished. With deliberate precision, he lowered his salute and came to an even more rigid attention position. "Admiral Webb, sir, I respectfully request permission to speak freely." The request was a formality, but it carried weight in military protocol. Webb found himself in the position of either granting permission, which would allow Rodriguez to speak his mind publicly, or denying it, which would appear to be an attempt to silence legitimate concerns. "Granted," Webb said through gritted teeth, though he clearly regretted the word as soon as it left his mouth. Rodriguez took a deep breath and looked directly into Webb's eyes. "Sir, I have served in special operations for 15 years. I have worked with dozens of officers, some excellent, some adequate, and some who should never have been given command responsibility. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell ranks among the finest leaders I have ever served under, regardless of gender." He paused for a moment, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "Sir, when you question her qualifications based on gender rather than performance, you are not protecting the integrity of our operations. You are undermining it. You are telling every member of this team that merit matters less than prejudice, that political considerations outweigh proven capability." The room was absolutely silent as Rodriguez delivered what amounted to a masterclass in respectful but devastating criticism. He was using Webb's own words against him, turning the Admiral's arguments about maintaining operational effectiveness into an indictment of his discriminatory policies. "Furthermore, sir," Rodriguez continued, his voice gaining strength, By attempting to remove Lieutenant Commander Mitchell from her position despite her exemplary record, you are sending a message to every woman in the military that no matter how well they perform, their service will never be valued equally. You are discouraging exactly the kind of dedicated, capable officers that our military needs most. Admiral Webb's face had gone from purple back to red, then to a pale white as the implications of Rodriguez's words sank in. The chief petty officer had not just defended Sarah, he had attacked the entire philosophical foundation of Webb's position with surgical precision. The silence that followed Rodriguez's words was profound and heavy. Admiral Webb stood frozen, his face cycling through various shades of anger and disbelief as he processed what had just occurred. For the first time in his lengthy career, he found himself completely outmaneuvered by subordinates who had used his own regulations and principles against him with devastating effectiveness. What Webb had not anticipated was the presence of Captain James Sullivan, the base commanding officer, who had been standing quietly in the back corner of the room. Sullivan was a decorated veteran with a reputation for fairness and integrity, and more importantly, he was Webb's superior officer. He had entered the room shortly after Webb's opening remarks and had witnessed the entire confrontation unfold with growing interest and concern. Captain Sullivan stepped forward, his movement causing every person in the room to stiffen slightly. His presence changed the entire dynamic of the situation, as both Webb and the assembled SEALs realized that their confrontation now had a witness whose opinion could make or break careers. "Admiral Webb," Sullivan said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of command, "I've been listening to this discussion with great interest. I think we need to examine the facts more carefully before making any personnel decisions." Webb turned toward Sullivan with obvious relief, clearly expecting support from a fellow senior officer. "Captain Sullivan, I'm glad you're here. As you can see, we have a serious discipline problem that needs to be addressed immediately. These men have demonstrated clear insubordination, and Lieutenant Commander Mitchell has shown that she lacks the authority necessary to maintain proper order." But Sullivan's expression remained neutral as he surveyed the scene. His experienced eyes took in the formation of the SEALs, still standing at attention, their bearing impeccable despite the extraordinary circumstances. He noted Sarah's composure under pressure and the obvious respect the men showed for her leadership. "Admiral," Sullivan said carefully, "I'm curious about the specific performance issues that led to your decision to reassign Lieutenant Commander Mitchell. Could you provide the details from her evaluation reports?" The question caught Webb off guard. In his anger and certainty about his position, he had not prepared for a detailed review of Sarah's actual performance records. He had assumed that his authority as a superior officer would be sufficient to justify his decisions without extensive documentation. "The issues are well documented," Webb said, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "There are concerns about her ability to maintain discipline and command respect from the men under her command." Sullivan's eyebrow rose slightly as he glanced around the room at the assembled SEALs, who were still maintaining their respectful but defiant stance. "Interesting. The men appear to be demonstrating considerable respect for their commanding officer. Perhaps you could be more specific about these discipline issues?" Rodriguez, sensing an opportunity, requested permission to speak. Sullivan nodded, understanding that getting the enlisted perspective would provide valuable insight into the true situation. "Sir," Rodriguez said, addressing Sullivan directly, "I would like to provide some context for Admiral Webb's concerns. Over the past 18 months, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell has successfully led our team through 37 combat operations with 0 casualties and a 100% mission success rate. Her tactical decisions have been consistently sound, her leadership under fire has been exemplary, and her dedication to the welfare of her team has been unwavering. Sullivan listened with growing interest as Rodriguez provided specific examples of Sarah's leadership and performance. Other team members were given permission to speak, and they painted a picture of an officer who had not only met the demands of her position, but had exceeded them in every measurable category. As the testimonials continued, Admiral Webb's position became increasingly untenable. The evidence being presented was comprehensive, specific, and impossible to dismiss. These were not vague character references, but detailed accounts of performance under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Captain Sullivan turned to Webb with a puzzled expression. "Admiral, these performance reports don't seem to support your concerns about Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's effectiveness. In fact, they suggest exactly the opposite. Could you explain the discrepancy?" Webb found himself trapped between his personal beliefs and the overwhelming evidence of Sarah's competence. His face flushed again as he struggled to find a way to justify his position without explicitly revealing his gender-based prejudice. "The issue is not just individual performance," Webb said, his voice becoming more defensive. "It's about the broader implications of women in combat roles, the physical and emotional demands." "Admiral," Sullivan interrupted, his voice taking on a sharper edge, "are you suggesting that Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's gender is the primary factor in your evaluation of her performance?" The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Webb realized that he had been cornered into revealing the true nature of his opposition to Sarah's continued service in special operations. Any answer he gave would either expose his discriminatory motivations or force him to contradict his earlier statements. Sarah watched the exchange with fascination and growing hope. For the first time since the confrontation began, she sensed that the tide was turning in her favor. Captain Sullivan's questions were forcing Webb to confront the weakness of his position and the problematic nature of his reasoning. "I believe," Webb said slowly, clearly choosing his words carefully, "that there are inherent differences between men and women that make certain military roles more suitable for one gender than the other." Sullivan's expression hardened noticeably. "Admiral Webb, that position is contrary to current Department of Defense policy regarding gender integration in combat roles. More importantly, it appears to be contradicted by the evidence presented here today regarding Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's performance." The room's atmosphere shifted palpably as Sullivan's words sank in. Webb had not just revealed his personal prejudices, he had openly opposed official military policy in front of witnesses. His position had evolved from questionable to potentially career-ending. Rodriguez and the other SEALs maintained their positions, but their tension was beginning to ease as they realized that Captain Sullivan was taking their concerns seriously. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension, understanding that while the immediate threat to her career might be diminishing, the broader implications of this confrontation were still unfolding. Captain Sullivan walked over to Sarah and looked directly into her eyes. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, do you feel that your gender has interfered with your ability to perform your duties effectively?" "No, sir," Sarah replied without hesitation. "While I have certainly faced unique challenges, I believe my performance record speaks for itself. These men have trusted me with their lives, and I have never betrayed that trust." Sullivan nodded and turned back to Admiral Webb. "Admiral, based on what I've heard here today, I see no justification for reassigning Lieutenant Commander Mitchell based on performance concerns. Her record is exemplary, her team clearly respects her leadership, and your stated reasons for the reassignment appear to be based on personal opinion rather than objective evaluation." Webb's face went white as the full implications of Sullivan's words became clear. He was being publicly rebuked by a superior officer, his authority was being undermined, and his discriminatory attitudes were being exposed for everyone to see. "Furthermore," Sullivan continued, his voice gaining strength, "I am deeply troubled by the apparent bias that has influenced your decision-making process. This kind of prejudice has no place in our military, and it certainly has no place in personnel decisions affecting dedicated officers like Lieutenant Commander Mitchell." The SEALs remained at attention, but Sarah could see the satisfaction in their eyes. They had taken an enormous risk by challenging Admiral Webb's authority, and their gamble was paying off. Their loyalty to her was being vindicated, and their faith in the ultimate fairness of the military system was being restored. Admiral Webb made one last desperate attempt to salvage his position. "Captain Sullivan, you don't understand the full situation. The integration of women into special operations is a political experiment that is compromising our effectiveness. These men are too emotionally invested to see the bigger picture." But Sullivan was having none of it. "Admiral Webb, what I see here is a group of elite warriors showing respect and loyalty to an officer who has earned both through exceptional service. What I don't see is any evidence supporting your claims about compromised effectiveness or political experimentation." Sullivan paused and looked around the room, making eye contact with each person present. "What I do see is a successful combat leader being targeted for reassignment based on gender rather than performance. This is exactly the kind of discrimination that our policies are designed to prevent." The captain's words carried the weight of final judgment. Admiral Webb's attempt to humiliate Sarah had not only failed, but had backfired spectacularly. His own prejudices had been exposed, his authority had been undermined, and his career prospects had been severely damaged. Rodriguez finally spoke again, his voice carrying a note of quiet triumph. "Sir, on behalf of SEAL Team 7, I want to state for the record that we have complete confidence in Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's leadership and request that she be allowed to continue in her current position." One by one, the other team members voiced their agreement. Their earlier gesture of solidarity had evolved into something more powerful, a formal statement of support that would become part of the official record. Captain Sullivan nodded with satisfaction. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell will remain in her current position. Her performance will continue to be evaluated based on objective criteria and mission effectiveness, not on outdated prejudices or personal bias." He turned to Admiral Webb with an expression that conveyed both disappointment and warning. "Admiral, I suggest you take some time to reflect on the events of today and consider whether your approach to personnel decisions is consistent with the values and policies of our organization." As the meeting concluded, Sarah felt a profound sense of vindication and gratitude. The men who had stood with her had risked everything to defend principles that went beyond personal loyalty. They had shown that true military brotherhood was based on mutual respect earned through shared sacrifice, not on superficial characteristics like gender or background. Admiral Webb left the room in silence. His earlier confidence replaced by the grim understanding that his attempt to end Sarah's career had instead ended his own credibility. The SEALs maintained their professional bearing, but their quiet satisfaction was unmistakable. In the days that followed, word of the confrontation spread throughout the military community. Sarah's story became a symbol of the changing nature of the armed forces, proof that merit and performance could ultimately triumph over prejudice and discrimination. The courage shown by her team became legendary among special operations units, demonstrating that true warriors stand together regardless of gender, race, or background. Admiral Webb requested a transfer to a different command, his influence and authority permanently damaged by his public display of bias. Captain Sullivan ensured that Sarah's record reflected not just her individual achievements, but also the extraordinary loyalty and respect she had earned from her team. Years later, as Sarah continued to serve with distinction and eventually achieved flag rank herself, she would often reflect on that day in the briefing room. It had been a moment when principles mattered more than politics, when courage trumped prejudice, and when a group of elite warriors proved that true strength comes from standing together in defense of what is right. The salute her men had given her that day represented more than military courtesy or personal loyalty. It represented a fundamental truth about service and sacrifice, that respect must be earned, that leadership is proven through action, and that the bonds forged in combat transcend all artificial barriers imposed by prejudice or fear.